Hi y'all, so it's true story time. So while I was doing some research trying to figure out what part of Africa did the slaves in South Carolina derive from, because I'm from South Carolina and I'm just trying to figure out who I am, I came across a very interesting historical story, right? And this story is about the Stono Rebellion. Now, I'm quite embarrassed to say I didn't know about this story because I'm from South Carolina, but then again, they kept a lot of our history away from us, so I'm not that embarrassed. Okay, so the Stono Rebellion revolves around a slave that went by the name of Jemmy Cato. Now, Cato was said to be his slave master's last name, and Jimmy wasn't his first name either. I mean, he was an Angolan slave from the Congo area. So, of course, that wasn't his real name. So, basically, he was known to be like a warrior in the Congo area, an Angolan warrior, and he was already very familiar with like weapons and things of that nature. So, and he was literate too. So, those are some important facts to take in mind as we get through this story. So, around this time, the Spanish had invaded and started taking over this Florida area. Now, they were offering slaves freedom and land if they could make it down to the St. Augustine area. This is around 1733 when they started offering land and offering freedom to the slaves, but the whole story for the Stono River started in 1739. Okay? So Jimmy was like, all right, Jimmy ended up escaping and running away from South Carolina and traveled all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida. Now, if you're looking at this map here, you will see that there's no Georgia area there. There's just South Carolina and Florida. Now, I've traveled from Charleston area to St. Augustine area before, and it's about 5 hours, roughly 5.5 hours. Now, imagine doing this on foot. That had to take like weeks at a time. And in addition to that, like all the animals and gators and snakes and stuff up in that area. Whew. But anyway, Jimmy made it. He made it all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida. And sure enough, when he got there, they said, all right, if you can go back and get the rest of your friends and family, we will also give them land and freedom. Now, mind you, the Spanish whole goal at this time was just to cripple the British colonies by taking away their prime resources, which mean they took away their slaves. They didn't have anything else. Like that's it. They crippled the economy for the British. So that's what they were trying to do. So Jimmy was like, okay, bet. Jimmy left and went back up to South Carolina. So Jimmy ended up getting to South Carolina around September 8th, 9th, 1739. Okay, I said 8th because he had to kind of have some time to kind of gather around and have conversations with the people that he wanted to, do the rebellion with, because they all ended up meeting on September 9th, 1739 at Stono River, hence the name the Stono Rebellion. Now, they met on a Sunday morning. That was a Sunday morning, and they met on that particular morning because the white slave masters they were kind of required to take their weapons with them to church Sunday morning. I'm not sure why, but that was something that they had to do. They had to take their weapons with them and go to church on Sunday morning. So, what ended up happening was they met at the river that morning, and they made their way down and started traveling south. They made their way down to Hutchinson's General Store. Now, Hutchinson's General Store, if you looking into the background of this story, you'll find that this story is also called the Hutchinson's Rebellion. Okay? Now, in the store, there were 2 storekeepers, 20 or so slaves that had gathered together to do the rebellion. They went into the Hutchinson store and offed the storekeepers very brutally. And they took all the guns and all the gunpowder that was in the store, and they continued to march south. Now, every plantation that they hit, they ended the slave masters and their families. Okay, and more slaves started to gather with them. Now, while they're marching, they're playing their drums with their African drum beats and everything, and they're chanting liberty. So they're doing this, and they're marching down the street. Well, I don't know if there were streets or not, okay, but they marching, in the south direction towards freedom. Okay? Now, they ended all of the slave plantation owners and their families that they came across, with the exception of one. And they said they didn't end him because he was kind to his slaves. So they showed him mercy and they passed him. Getting some momentum, what happened was basically there was I guess he was kind of like a militia type British colonist, but he saw them coming in advance, like in the distance, and he was able to get away and go back and warn the planters and the slave owners that there was an insurrection going on and a rebellion going on, and that they needed to prepare. And at this time, there's between 60 and 100 slaves that are marching and playing their drums and chanting liberty. And they marched all the way into late afternoon, late evening time period, actually. They marched all the way until they got towards the Edisto River. Now, Edisto River is also in South Carolina. And once they got there, they were met by a group, a swarm of slave owners and plantation owners who also had guns and everything. So they were severely outnumbered at this point, especially weapon wise, because they didn't have that many guns. They just had what they took from the Hitchison's general store. And at this point, it turned brutal, like a massacre. 40 of the slaves, and the ones that didn't get ended up running away and going into the woods, and they would soon be hunted down and either offed or captured and sold back into slavery one by one. The slaves that they ended up capturing, they sold them off to the West Indies. Now, what happened as a result of this rebellion, now mind you, slaves were severely outnumbering slave masters at the time because they were greedy and they just wanted more and more slaves to do their labor. So they were terrified at this point because they are trying to prevent this from happening again, and trying to prevent word from spreading because they find out, they had a rebellion here, and they figure out, some of the slaves are starting to get brave. They're trying to use any tactic that they can at this point to keep it from happening again. And this is where they started enforcing more buck breaking. And if you don't know what buck breaking is, it's basically when they take the biggest and strongest of the slaves and basically tear him down in front of the rest of the slaves to kind of install fear into them. It's a scare tactic. At this point, they reinforced multiple acts, and the Negro Act of 1740 was one of them. And they had a lot of stipulations already in place, like they weren't supposed to learn how to read, they weren't supposed to be able to assemble in the same place, they weren't supposed to be able to grow their own crops, things of that nature. But they weren't enforced. Now they were enforcing them because Jimmy knew how to read, and a lot of the other slaves, they knew how to read. They were not. They were allowed to kind of learn how to use weapons and things of that nature. But at this point, the slave masters, slave owners, were adamant about making sure that these rules are enforced. Okay, so they took the ability for them to learn how to read away, started forcing them to go to church and kind of pushing thou shalt obey thy slave master onto them because it's in the Bible. So they started using those tactics to kind of say, you need to obey your slave master or else you're going to, burn in HE double hockey sticks, that type of thing. In addition to what happened, there was a general at the time named there was a governor at the time named Governor Williams Bulls. So what he did was wrote a letter back to over to Britain and basically explained what happened. And in this letter, what really struck me as very interesting was the fact that he went on to say that he offered awards to the Indians, the Native Americans, to help recapture some of the slaves that had got off and ran away. And I thought that was very interesting. Now, I've heard several stories, that stated that slaves were also, that Indians also owned slaves. But, this was, kind of like a, Anyway, what do you guys think?